Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to another Warhammer 40k lore video, where today we're going to talk about heretics within the Imperium, and more importantly, how the Imperium locates and deals with these unwanted nonconformists. But first, this video is sponsored by Gilded Destiny. Now, this is a game I actually had my eyes on before the developers reached out to me, because after the enormous disappointment that was Victoria 3, there, well, just aren't that many games on the market that covers this particularly interesting era of industrial revolution. So if you two find the period appealing, I would recommend checking out their Kickstarter page, which went live just the other day, and maybe their Steam page as well for a bit more information, as the developers have already released 14 dev blogs as of the recording of this video, talking about the game's ideas, its mechanics, and what it wants to achieve. The Kickstarter campaign will run for 30 days, or about 25 on by the time you are seeing this, so again, if interested, check out their Steam page and check out their Kickstarter page. There will be links to both of them in the description down below. Now then, the Imperium. It is, of course, an enormously, mind-bogglingly, bafflingly complex machine, made up of a million, trillion, billion little spinning puzzle pieces, which very rarely fit perfectly together. Accurately steering, controlling, or even pretending to point in the general direction such an absurdly huge and Byzantine mechanism as the Imperium would be a fool's errand at the best of times, and the 41st millennium is not the best of times, as the already tottering bureaucratic machinery is constantly being pushed and prodded and undermined and maliciously sabotaged by the arch-enemy of humanity and life in general, chaos. Now, sometimes the face of the arch-enemy is pretty easily discernible, like the snarling helmet of a 3 meters tall space marine wielding a booming bolter. That one's kinda hard to miss. Or a towering, demon-possessed titan. That too is not necessarily subtle. Not to mention a wide variety of fairly obviously demonic creatures like bloodletters, bloodthirsters, nurglings, screamers, etc., etc. But unfortunately for the Imperium, chaos is not always quite so overt. In fact, the greatest danger to the Imperium probably doesn't come from the overt militarism of chaos at all. Sure, it raids planets, it burns down entire cities and kills millions, but frankly, the military threat is not that big of a deal. The overwhelming majority of Chaos's forces is cooped up within the Eye of Terror, under the command of a mouth-breathing moron. Even if we were to adapt modern-day 40k lore, where Chaos is more of a threat because they've managed to break out of the Cadian Gate, still, they're holding on to a fraction of the galaxy compared to the size of the Imperium. And this is after 10,000 years of erosion and degradation. If the Imperium was free to focus its entire will and efforts on chaos alone, they would never even leave the Eye, much less manage what they did in the Gathering Storm. But, of course, that is not the only threat that the Imperium faces. It is under attack from a multitude of forces across a multitude of fronts, and one of those fronts is the home front. As Chaos's most powerful, vicious and deadly weapon is not its fleets, it is not its armies of cultists, or its hordes of demonic creatures, or even its Chaos Space Marine legions, but rather, as it has always been, the rot at the heart of every living being. Pride, insecurities, ambitions, desires, violent urges, etc., etc., etc. The rot has many names, and all of them are known to the great powers, who revel, of course, in the fact that all of these weaknesses are also absolutely, intrinsically linked to the human condition. These inimicable weaknesses have plagued our species and damn near every other species as well, ever since they crawled their way out of whatever primordial ooze birthed them. And as there is no surefire way of extricating these vices from humanity, eternal vigilance is the only hope for a soul's salvation. But occasionally, individual vigil and responsibility requires a little bit of reinforcing, a little bit of aid. And that is where the firm stick of Imperial law enforcement comes into the picture. A whole bevy of sticks, in fact. Some exemplary, some demonstrative, some remonstrative, and some outright punitive. Oh, the Imperium has plenty of sticks with which to beat non-believers with. The problem is, sometimes they can be very difficult to find. As in sharp contrast to the Chaos Space Marine or the demon-possessed Titan, the average cultist knows very well what happens to him if he is revealed. And in fact, the average cultist in many cases doesn't even know what he's doing, or that it's really as bad as it actually is. Subtlety and stealth are the main weapons of the cult, after all. So, how does the Imperium even begin to deal with all of this? How does it begin to not only hunt them down, but prevent them from beginning to grow in the first place? Well, obviously, the first step is the Imperial cult itself. The best way to defeat other religious beliefs is, well, with a religious belief of your own, or some sort of superior truth around which the populace can rally. This was, in many ways, the foundational principle of the Imperial truth, which was the Emperor's master plan to eradicate superstition from the galaxy and thus in turn either kill off, or at the very least deprive the Chaos powers of their power. It wasn't a bad idea, and it might very well have worked out for all we know, but in the current 41st millennium, that's gonna be a hard sell, considering the original inventor of the Imperial truth is hailed as a god now, and demons are pretty much just common knowledge that they exist. So, Plan B, then. Overriding any potentially heretical teachings with those of the Imperial cult. Now, the Imperial cult itself does have official teachings and doctrines, which they will attempt to spread wherever possible, but these are often overridden by local variants of the Imperial cult, be they dependent upon local religious practices. Imperial saints, for example, the Sabbat Worlds is an excellent example of this, where Saint Sabbat is obviously not superior to the Emperor, but she and her teachings are worshipped primarily as the main forward-facing aspect of the Imperial cult, rather than the more standardized doctrine that you might see Solwards, for example. This doesn't make them heretics, and indeed there are many interpretations of the God Emperor. Even backwater savages that worship the Emperor simply as a solar deity could be as faithful as any high ecclesiarch. So long as the teachings of the Emperor, be he sun god or living deity, are actively in opposition to the forces of chaos, that is good enough. There are problems here, however. Now, in part, the flexibility of the Imperial cult is an unavoidable consequence of the fact that it covers millions of stars and trillions upon trillions of people. You're never going to get all of them to agree on the exact same interpretation, as it obviously will be shaped by local customs, local history, yada 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 yada, especially after 10,000 odd years. Now, the Imperial Church hasn't been an organization on quite the scale that it is today for all that time, but you get the general idea. This means that it's occasionally difficult to separate a heretical belief from a real and true one. The gene-stealer cults do this all the time, and there are well-documented examples of apparently loyal population groups rising up in violent revolt against the Empire as it is revealed that their seemingly beneficial variant on the Imperial cult's beliefs were in fact some sort of blood-sacrificing murder ritual. I know, it sounds like it's difficult to miss, but considering there are even entire Space Marine chapters out there that conduct ritualistic sacrifice, well, the mere presence of sacrificial rituals in and of itself is not enough to get the Ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition to turn on the sirens and start screaming. Nevertheless, the Imperial cult is an excellent tool in preventative warfare. If you create a theology that declares your opposition to be evil, inimicably evil, baby-eatingly evil, then it's going to be rather difficult for whatever you've labelled as such to get a solid grasp in society. And this is the reason why the cults tend to not openly advertise that they're actually demon-worshipping madmen. It tends to turn people off for some reason. Which does bear a certain resemblance to certain modern-day political ideologies that tend to hide the cost of their preferred goals, but we're deviating from the point. This means that the cults themselves will be forced to be quite sneaky about it. Now, not all cults are sneaky. In fact, some cults are very, very idiotic, and actually get caught fairly quickly, as the Imperial cult also provides a wonderful early warning system. If, again, you've taught the entire populace that if they see certain things, like a skull rune, for example, then you should immediately run as fast as your little feet can carry you to local law enforcement, who will then drag whoever possessed the skull rune out into the public square, where he shall be swiftly lynched by the theocratic majority. This is not only a speedy measure for dealing with the more retarded cultists out there, but also a wonderful way in turning every single loyal Imperial citizen into a walking surveillance camera, constantly investigating their neighbours and checking if they haven't drawn any weird doodles lately. Obviously, this is going to have certain drawbacks in terms of personal freedom, and the occasional innocent person being beaten to death for what appeared to be a skull rune, but on later investigation turned out to be a poorly drawn dog, but sometimes sacrifices have to be made. Unfortunately, smarter, repressive methods eventually led to a better breed of heretical nonconformist scum, more difficult to oppress than previous groupings. These started to figure out that the best way to survive in Imperial society and keep doing what they were doing was to be quiet about it. Now, even in the modern-day Imperium, most wannabe heretics are probably discovered very early, or simply mess up in some way or another. Heretical knowledge is obviously very rare in the Imperium. This isn't something you can pop down to the local bookstore to get or anything. Incidentally, this is why controlling knowledge of chaos is actually a fully valid tactic. A lot of people often say that, hey, if they just disseminated knowledge about chaos to everyone, then people would know what to look out for. Yeah, but they'd also get easy access to the information about chaos. That's the issue. Chaos is in and of itself a naturally corrosive force, and ignorance, unironically, is strength. If you cannot get a hold of any way to conduct these various nonsensical rituals, and if you indeed view them as nonsensical, you are significantly less likely to try and pursue them. Bearing in mind as well that this is kind of the idea of weakness. Yet again, that's what chaos aims in at, not the rational mind. Chaos aims at the grieving mother that recently lost a child in a senseless fire, which might then look at certain forbidden texts promising the return of beloved, long-dead children with a bit more interest than normal. But if this is simply just an absolute absurd impossibility, well, she won't. Bit of an extreme example, but You get my drift, I'm certain. Instead, the cults will then begin to recruit very, 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 very secretively and very, very, very slowly. Indeed, many of them will be formed not even as cults, but, say for example, the dalliancers of upper spire nobility. Getting bored with their everyday lives of fucking bitches and riding water skis around their daddy's pool all day, and seeking out something taboo, something forbidden. This is a seemingly unavoidable consequence of getting access to vast quantities of power and or wealth: boredom. With the following on interesting hobbies that this tends to breed in virtually anyone and everyone. Now, the bratty little bitches might not have the faintest idea what they're doing, but one of them gets a hold of a manuscript, which he's totally been told by this black market dealer that he knew, that it would be all kinds of occult knowledge. And knowing that this will make him the toast of his friend group, goes like, look here guys, look at this. And then they carry it out, and it's not actually quite as nonsensical as they might have hoped it to be. It might even be corrupting just to have the knowledge in and of itself. There are plentiful chaos artifacts that will easily dominate lesser minds. And what could possibly be a lesser mind than a rich frat boy? What, you can argue? There are, of course, also other ways that this could happen. Simple need, as mentioned previously. Maybe the harvests have failed one too many times. Maybe a traveling salesperson promises a weird little ritual thing. Nothing heretical, mind you. I've just got this little statue right here, and, you know, if you give it some grain, it'll totally improve your harvest. What could go wrong? You give it a little grain and, hey, bumper crops next year. Well, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? Oh, but, there's a little inscription on the thing, like, offer me something, you know, and I'll give you something in return. Okay, if your little grain gives a bumper harvest, well, where is this little lamb? What about that? Oh, even bigger harvest. And then they start looking suspiciously at the children in the local community, wondering. And on occasion, it could be even more subtle than this. It could be a slow decline that could take decades, if not centuries, as a certain heretical belief worms its way into a local community, until it is so generally accepted that it's not even viewed as heretical. And obviously, it could also be significantly more overt. It could be active infiltration by chaotic forces. It could be an agent placed there for the Alpha Legion, for all anybody knows, that actually has the express objective to begin building a cult, to start culminating and growing their belief structure amongst the local populace. It takes many forms, but the key point here is secrecy. The obvious cultists, the stupid cultists, are going to get killed and rounded up quite quickly by the local community. The slightly more clever ones, well, that's where we move on to the next line of defense: policing. Not the Adeptus Arbites, mind you, local policing. See, all but the largest, most important and centralized hive worlds are not going to have any real significant Adeptus Arbites presence. The overwhelming majority of worlds in the Imperium will be kept in order by local enforcement officers, obeying local laws and local regulations rather than Imperial law. Obviously, Imperial law is superior to all other law, but again, you get the drift. And obviously, anything that resembles heretical activity is deeply illegal, as that part of the Imperial cult is probably going to shine through literally anywhere. And seeing as Imperial governors are there to, well, impose Imperial law, order, and religion on the worlds, he's hardly going to overlook that part of the legislative process. The local police forces are, of course, not going to have any sort of expert knowledge in this regard, but they're going to have generalistic knowledge. If, say, a corpse washes up on shore with lots of weird stab wounds in the shape of a pentagram, they're probably going to give that a little bit of extra attention, you know? Simultaneously, if a lot of people start disappearing in a certain area and rumors start abounding about strange, dark rituals, that too is bound to draw a great deal of law enforcement attention. They don't need to understand chaos to know what to look for, and again, the broadest possible sense. Local law enforcement will thus be able to root out a fair few amateur cults, shall we say. The aforementioned fertility example. If local law enforcement notices that a community that has been plagued by poor harvests due to maybe soil imbalances, maybe the village is close by to somewhere that just, pumps toxin into the water or something, and yet suddenly, despite a lengthy record of poor harvests, they're coming to market with just bushels and bushels and bushels and bushels year in and year out. You'd probably start getting a bit suspicious at some point, wouldn't you? In essence, a lot of this is going to get resolved on the local rumor style level, where there might be investigations into the histories of the area, the causes of whatever phenomena is being investigated, and if they discover cult-like activities, they're probably going to err on the side of caution, shall we say. And in the 41st millennium, that tends to include a flamethrower and some rapid-fire automatic weaponry. On some cases, though, it's going to be too subtle for local law enforcement. In these cases, there is a second fallback without going to, the inevitable full-scale investigation, which is the Adeptus Arbites. Now, obviously, the Arbites are first and foremost occupied with the enforcement of Imperial law, not heretical activity in and of itself. But the officers of the Arbites are going to have access to significantly greater knowledge and resources than local law enforcement. They're also going to know more what they're looking for. And in many cases, I would imagine that local law enforcement could send in a request to have Arbites officers stop by. Now, whether or not that request would be humoured is an entirely different question, as in many cases, individual officers have oversight of entire systems or entire planets. Their plates can tend to be pretty damn full. And this, incidentally, is one of the weaknesses of not giving your people enough information. Information can be dangerous, that point still stands, but if there was a centralized heretic database, in essence, that outlined general cultist or ritualistic practices, even on a rough level, so that law enforcement could cross-check things with this database, a kind of, serial killer profiler, but for heretics, that probably would help law enforcement a lot in figuring out what they are dealing with. But that would also require you to trust the average beat cop, or detective more correctly probably, with that kind of information, and that might not be the best of ideas, really. Assuming then that the Adeptus Arbites do have time to check in, they are, as mentioned, going to have better resources and better knowledge. But cults that are really starting to get going are going to have built several more layers of subterfuge over this again. Now, theoretically, the Arbites have enough authority to do just about anything on a local level. They can enforce the Imperial law into planetary governors, so they do have a fair bit of power. But the main problem is they are still lacking in expert expertise. And a cult that has survived for long enough to become a genuine threat, or to become so subtle as to avoid detection, might require a far defter touch. Which is where we arrive at the third and the final line of defense. The God Emperor's most Holy Inquisition, of course. Or, more precisely, their adepts and agents first. See, An Inquisitor isn't going to get involved with every little bit of heretical knowledge or rumour-mongering. He's not going to go visit a backwater village that has had a weirdly good crop or anything like that, or even rumours about local highborn frat bitches talking about weird glowing lights in the sky or anything. Of course not. He's got far better things to do. He has actual cults to deal with, actual alien invasions. He deals with the manifestations of these things, usually when they've gotten a little bit too far, or right before they're getting to that point. Simply because there are so many of them, he's not going to have time for the rest. But inquisitorial agents will have access to a lot more knowledge and a lot more specialized understanding of the problems they are looking at. Especially in the case of the agents of the Ordo Hereticus. And agents can be at virtually any level. Many Inquisitors choose to retain enormous retinues of agents, essentially as local informants, sprinkling them across planets and cities and all kinds of things. There could be thousands of inquisitorial agents on a single planet, as there's no upper limit to how many an Inquisitor can have. If anything, the upper limit is determined by his organization's ability to process data, in essence. One of these agents might see the bumper crop village and local law enforcement finds nothing wrong, but he gets suspicious and investigates and finds the statue. Now, he can't come up with anything direct, it doesn't match any descriptions that he knows, and the inscriptions on it, like, give me a sacrifice. Could mean anything. It could be innocent, it could not be innocent. Well, that agent does have access to that central database, the Inquisition's own archives. Now, your average agent isn't going to be doing anything about this himself. He's going to be sending this further up the chain to the various adepts of the Inquisitor, those who usually wield at least parts of his authority, many of which will build their own networks of agents in return as well to further aid their master in their works. This is where we get to a fairly high level of authority, as an inquisitorial adept can do a lot of things. They're often given a pseudo-rosetta, basically a, hey, I'm with the big guy thing, which unlocks the doors containing all the vaults with all the books, which show that, this exact statue is actually pretty goddamn sus, because it depicts an image of Slanesh, for example, fertility, or Nurgle, the absence of disease in this case, as Nurgle can control disease as well, and he'll usually ask for more extreme things over time, rather than just the bumper crops. Now, they've got something to go on. Now they can actually start to figure out the scale of this. Is this an accident, in which case they'll only burn the village? Or is this deliberate malice? Is there a larger hand at play? Is there an agenda here? Because there very well might be. This is also where the deeper investigation comes. Even if local law enforcement did burn the village, that might not have been the end of the threat. It might simply have cut off one of the Hydra's countless heads. And really, when you get to that point, you need to escalate it to the Inquisition level, because they're the only ones who are going to have the resources to track down the various heads of the Hydra, and hell, even confirm that the Hydra exists in the first place. And if evidence of a Hydra does emerge, that's when it goes to the actual Inquisitor level. If this turns out to be merely just the vanguard of a much larger cult, attempting to normalize whatever depiction of fertility that this statue represented, then you're going to need to hunt down that cult, uproot it, and determine whether or not it was the Hydra, or merely another head, and so on and so on. The regular Imperial servants, the local law enforcement, the Adeptus Arbites, they don't have the resources to do this, nor do they have really the remit or the authority to do this either. The Inquisition really is the only choice here. This is also a very good argument for the existence of the Inquisition, as you absolutely do need an organization with that kind of all-encompassing, overreaching authority to pull on every thread, no matter where it might lead you. There is, of course, an even higher level than this again, which is the Lord Inquisitor, the biggest boss man usually in entire sectors more often than not, or at least an inquisitorial conclave of Lord Inquisitors. If anything reaches this point, then we're not dealing with a cult anymore. We're probably dealing with something on the edges of a full-scale uprising, or something that has already corrupted planets, something that, when they finally pull on the last thread, the Hydra revealed probably has an army at its command, or a few Chaos Space Marines or something. Obviously, in an ideal world, the various cults and heretical organizations and even individual heretics will be taken care of long before this level. This is why this multifaceted approach exists, to attempt to nip it in the bud as often as possible. But again, the Imperium is simply too large for a more direct approach to this. The Inquisition really is kind of the most direct approach that the Imperium really can apply in hunting down these heretics. The Imperial cult is its most diffuse element, which simply attempts to build up a counter-doctrine. Local law enforcement is the next step, and local arbites the next step after there, in increasingly direct, but still not actually dedicated solutions. Only when you arrive at the Inquisition do you actually have the pinpoint precision knowledge required to dig out the more subtle infestations. A far from perfect solution to a problem that probably doesn't have a perfect solution. This isn't like criminals in our reality or serial killers or anything, where you can build up profiles, where you can catalogue evidence and look for similarities, even if those similarities do exist, and they do. As we've talked about previously, how cults grow, for example. There are many doctrinal things there, and indeed larger cults that have spread over several planets will probably have a pre-created step-by-step instruction guide, in essence, on how to establish themselves. There are signs, and there are absolutely ways to determine what one of these cults might be, where it operates, to what scale it does, etc., etc. But if the very possession of this knowledge is in and of itself corruptive, as it does appear to be to some degree at least, then all you can really do is keep whacking at the moles with the biggest hammer you can find. Not because every cult is a nail, but because the only tool you have at your disposal is a hammer. I do so enjoy the logic of the 41st millennium, especially in cases like this where, despite the seeming absurdity of it, yeah, it does make sense. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all soon, and do check out Gilded Destiny. I've got a bit of hope for this one. I don't know, I got a good feeling about it. Have a good night.